This is K.M. Weiland, and you are listening to the 529th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. What is Dreamzoning? 7 steps to finding new story ideas. Every writer knows a thing or two about daydreaming. But what about dreamzoning? What is that, and how can it help you cultivate inspiration for your storytelling? Put simplistically, dreamzoning is basically just daydreaming on steroids. It's purposeful, focused daydreaming. It's intense, it's fun, and if you're a writer, it's the motherlode of all story ideas. I have name-dropped dreamzoning a lot in recent years, but after an exchange on Patreon with Susan Geiger, I realized some readers may not fully understand what I'm talking about. Susan said, I look forward to trying out dreamzoning. I've heard you talk about it on your podcast before, but never fully understood it. So, because dreamzoning is such an amazing tool and experience, I figured it was time to do a core episode about it. The word dreamzone came into my consciousness years ago when I read From Where You Dream, a transcript of Pulitzer winner Robert Olin Butler's lectures about the process of writing fiction. In the book, he talked about how he would take the time to find story inspiration by sitting back at his desk and zoning out. He'd watch the pictures in his head, following them, not guiding them, but just watching to see what would unfold. Later, he would record the snippets of his imaginings on index cards and use them to formulate an outline. If he ran into a plot problem or question, he would revert to dreamzoning to find the solution. Now, like many writers, I immediately resonated with his description of this deeply intuitive mental space. I'd naturally gone there for years, even calling my imaginings my movies when I was young. The dream zone was the space I lived in between waking and sleep every night, as well as the space I physically played in as a child when acting out my stories, a practice that only petered out in my 20s. It is where I went mentally when doing the creative lollygagging chores of dishes or weeding. It's the space we all go to when we're in the throes of writing, and particularly when we've hit that sweet spot of the zone. That said, the act of dreamzoning itself is, as Butler indicates, always intentional. It is a purposeful quest into the land of stories in order to excavate needed inspiration. Dreamzoning is a way to fill the well so our creative output doesn't drain it. Dreamzoning can be done in any number of ways. It can involve sitting at one's desk with a handful of note cards like Butler, or it can happen on commutes with the scenery blurring past outside, or it can happen every night before sleep, or it can become a scheduled daily practice. Over the years, my own preferred setup for dreamzoning has come to revolve around 2 key ingredients: fire and music. It started years ago when my brother staged elaborate fire nights. Outside, under the full moon, he'd create themed sets around a campfire using a playlist for inspiration. There was a safari theme one night, a Dracula theme another. One year for Christmas, he created a winter wonderland complete with fairy lights, which my 2-year-old niece went wide-eyed over, but which unfortunately had to be called due to a blizzard. And later on, he'd just curate playlists. For me, the experiences naturally lent themselves to, you guessed it, zoning out and dropping in on my stories. I loved the experience so much and found it so conducive to inspiration that I eventually adopted it for myself. My fire nights, however, were significantly less elaborate, featuring a 3-wick candle instead of a full-on set. As I have struggled with burnout in the last few years, which, now that I think about it, coincided rather suspiciously with my brother's moving away and the end of the fire nights, but I've returned to this form of dreamzoning more consciously, incorporating it as a 15-minute practice at least 3 nights a week. Although I am occasionally reluctant to make the time, as soon as I drop in, I'm always reminded, oh yes, this is why I love stories. So, why should writers dreamzone? First and foremost, dreamzoning is fun, unless you happen to be that one brilliant adult who is still sword fighting and dragon riding out in the backyard on a regular basis. You've perhaps noticed the intense creativity of childhood doesn't always seem so available. Dream zoning is a way to access that regularly without throwing your back out or alarming the neighbors. The dream zone is a meditative state where your logical brain isn't allowed. Like any form of meditation, logical thoughts may knock at the door, but you keep returning to the intuitive center from which the stories spontaneously arise. If you use music, as I do, it can be an aid and a cue to guide the dreaming. Sometimes I see a full scene acted out, but often what I get is more like a music video, flashes of dramatic and symbolic imagery syncing up with the music. Sometimes I get a lot of good stuff, sometimes just one nugget, sometimes nothing. But the experience is always renewing and regenerative. It takes me back to the stories of my childhood, which were about nothing but play. And finally, like any meditative state, dream zoning can be calming and grounding in its own right within the mental buzziness of the normal day. Fun, useful, and healthy all at once. How about that? Ultimately, dream zoning is a highly personalized experience. You can do it randomly, or you can turn it into a daily practice, either right before writing or at another convenient time during the day. You can do it simply by leaning back and closing your eyes, or by staring into the corner. You can do it for 10 minutes, or you can do it for 2 hours. And in the right circumstances, the latter can be amazing. You can do it with props or without. You can create an elaborate set around a campfire with high-def speakers and a woofer, or you can opt for a candle and headphones. The only thing that really matters is that you create for yourself a situation in which you can tune out the world and really drop in to your imaginative center. The following 7 steps outline my own current process, which I have found highly effective. Step number 1, turn out the lights. And you might also add shut the door. The point is to create an environment in which you can tune out the rest of the world and your own chattering thoughts along with it. I do my dream zoning practice in the early evenings, which means it's not actually dark for half the year, but when it is, it's even better. And if you've opted for a fire pit under a full moon, better still. There's just something immersive about being wrapped in darkness when going deep into the story realm. It's like being in a huge dark theater while a gorgeous movie plays on the big screen. If nothing else, the darkness usually helps with concentration. Step number 2, light a candle and/or fire. The second concentration aid I've found transformative is fire. And this started with my brother's campfires, but for simplicity's sake has now devolved into a 3-wick candle on top of a trunk in my spare room. Spare room, after all, it's the portal to all fantasy realms. Especially when it's dark, the fire helps focus attention. The flames undulating is enough to keep your eyes' attention without distracting you. And plus, it's led me to a lot of great fireside scene ideas. Step number 3, set a playlist. The final magic ingredient is music. I set a playlist for the amount of time I want to dream zone, usually about 15 minutes or 3 songs. Sometimes I will specifically choose songs for a particular story I'm working on. Other times I'll just randomly select stuff and see where it takes me. Step number 4, get comfy. Find a position you can comfortably hold for the duration of your playlist. I generally sit cross-legged on a floor chair across from my candle. If I were dream zoning for a longer period of time, I would probably opt for a chair with a back. If you're outside at the fire pit, bundle up against the cold and or the mosquitoes. As ever, the point is to minimize distractions. Step number 5, drop in. The whole point of dream zoning is to get out of our logical, talky brains and into our deep, imaginative, intuitive cores. For me, as a visual thinker, this looks like mini movies playing in my head. Back in childhood, this zone was my preferred mental state. And these days, the talky brain sometimes has a hard time keeping quiet. It's kind of like a kid squirming in church. Particularly since my dream zone practice is only 15 minutes, it's important for me to drop in as quickly as possible and stay there. The music helps a ton. And honestly, so does the urgency. If I had an hour or two, I'd probably be a lot more lazy about disciplining my thoughts. Step number 6, find the zone. Usually, my brain will pick up a story thread right away, but sometimes it can take me a bit to find a dream that really resonates and interests me enough to follow it down the rabbit hole. If I'm struggling, I'll consciously bring up a specific story or a scene from the previous day's dream zoning and use it to kickstart my imagination. If I'm trying to work through a specific story question or problem, I will gently pose that to my brain, being careful not to start rationalizing answers, but just using the question as a prompt to see what my subconscious has in response. And step number 7, make notes. So finally, and this is super important, I make notes as soon as the dream zone practice is over. Otherwise, like my night dreams, my gleanings from the dream zone tend to slip away. I keep a running document of notes for all my story ideas, and at the end of a dream zone session, I'll just take a quick minute to type some one-sentence descriptions of ideas, answers, or images that I can use to trigger my memory later on when I start writing or plotting in a more logical way. When I look through my notes, I'm often surprised by all the good stuff I've recorded but have forgotten about in the interim. It always reignites my excitement about a story. When people ask me to name my favorite part of the writing process, my answer is always conception, or more to the point, daydreaming. Dream zoning has become my main go-to tool for retaining the playfulness of my childhood creativity in conceiving and nurturing my favorite ideas. It's good fun in its own right and an incredibly powerful tool for nurturing inspiration on a regular basis. So I hope you'll give it a try. And tell me your opinion. Have you ever tried any version of dream zoning? What was your experience? If you'd like to be part of the word player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast and add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Amazon Music, or whatever your favorite podcast platform may be. And if you'd like to do something to support helping writers become authors, it always means a ton if you're able to leave just a quick rating or review on your site of choice. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.